Hi, my name's Aliyya Swaby, and I'm the public education reporter for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in to this conversation on public education as part of the Texas Tribune Symposium on the future of rural Texas. I'm joined today by Gary VanDeaver, Georgina Pérez, and Donna Hale. To introduce our speakers, Gary VanDeaver has represented House District 1 since 2015. He sits on the Public Education and Appropriations Committees. Prior to his election to the Texas House, VanDeaver was a 33-year rural educator, serving most recently as superintendent of New Boston Independent School District in Bowie County. Georgina Pérez is a member of the State Board of Education, representing District. Previously, she served as an English teacher and administrator in the Isleta Independent School District for more than 10 years. Pérez is also the founder of the literature distribution nonprofit Tu Libro and the Cotton Valley Scholars Program. And lastly, we have Donna Hale, who's the superintendent of Miami ISD, a single campus district for grades pre-K through 12, located in the Texas Panhandle. In 2017, she was named the top superintendent in Region 16. Let's start by talking about the main challenge weighing on education and a lot of other issues right now, the ongoing pandemic, which is surging across the state, including in some of Texas's rural regions. Superintendent Hale, can you talk to us about how the pandemic has changed the way you've approached this school year?
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the invite to be here. It has definitely been a very challenging year. One of the things that I think most small and rural schools are struggling with is the complexity of the funding, such as the CARES Act process. It is very complex, and the time involved for that, a lot of superintendents and school leaders have decided not to apply for that funding. We just don't have the time available with all the other many hats we have to wear in a district. The TEA, the Operation Connectivity, has also been something that I found interesting. TEA donated 50% to whatever the bill was, our expenses. Then we were asked if we could find either the city or the county to contribute another 25%, and then TEA would contribute the remaining 25%. So I guess the question is, why could TEA not have just upfront done the 75% without us having to make more contacts, more connections when we were already extremely busy and overwhelmed?
Can you talk to me about how the funding is impacting things on the ground? Like, what would that mean for your ability to keep up health and safety standards, your ability to have instruction look the way that you want it to in a difficult year?
We have had to purchase additional Chromebooks, hotspots, LMS, just new curriculum that we have not had in place before for remote learning. We have had to buy thermometers, PPE, additional custodial service just to mitigate the risk of additional outbreaks of any COVID.
Yeah, and your district was one of a growing number of school districts that chose to get rid of the remote learning option in October, which has been controversial in some districts. What were the challenges for you of having students learning remotely and learning on campus at the same time?
The biggest challenge was just the lack of broadband internet. So we have students that do not have reliable internet, and when you're trying to do live teaching, it was constantly buffering. So students were frustrated, teachers were frustrated, parents are frustrated, and we had such a small percentage of students, actually we only had 2 at the time that were doing remote learning. And since we have had little, we've been very fortunate, little outbreak with the COVID, we felt it was in the students' best interest to come to campus.
Right. Representative VanDeaver, can you talk to us about what you're hearing from rural school districts about how they're weathering the pandemic, both financially and academically? And after, I'm going to go to you with that same question, Georgina.
Yes, and let me say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. It's a very important conversation. Much of what we just heard from superintendent is exactly what I'm hearing from the superintendents in my area, in my district. The challenges of the remote learning. We have schools that have a good number of students doing remote learning, and those students that are just really struggling to get those students in attendance, get those students engaged, and really have them take part in the education process. So they're very frustrated with that. Of course, broadband access continues to be such an issue in rural Texas, and we're seeing that in my district as well. Funding is certainly an issue. We see so many of our schools with students who are just not there and not sure where they are. I'm convinced they have not left, but they are not in school. And so what are we going to do moving forward to make the district whole, I think is a big question, because obviously under our current model, funding is based on student attendance. And so we have been able, the commissioner has been able to work with House Public Ed and Senate Ed to waive and kind of freeze funding through the semester, through Christmas, basically. And so what are we going to do beyond that, I think, is a real question.
Yeah, Georgina, do you want to jump in here?
So there's nothing different that's coming out of West Texas and along the border that Representative VanDeaver or Superintendent Hale haven't already mentioned. Our biggest challenge is, from the parent and student perspective, is the broadband connection. And out here where I live right now, we're on a satellite because there is no broadband infrastructure. And the idea that we had to have hotspots and Chromebooks as an additional expense for our school districts is just ridiculous, particularly in the 21st century. And then for people to learn, which is difficult to say, right? People are learning that in 2020, hotspots don't work in all geography. We've known this, right? Operation Connectivity is doing yet again another study to tell us what we have known for 20 years, if not longer. And so it feels like we're spending a lot of time not solving the problem.
Great. I've talked to a couple of rural school superintendents just in my reporting who have said that they feel like there's a lot of emphasis right now on urban and suburban school districts in proposing solutions for the pandemic, and not necessarily a lot of them on rural school districts. Georgina, maybe let's start with you. What are the ways in which you feel like those differences are most pronounced? Like, what are things that are just not true for rural school districts that are maybe more true for urban and suburban school districts?
So in rural El Paso County, which is far east El Paso County, I think the myth is that we're, number one, a suburban area. We're not. Number two, that school buses can drive through dirt roads. They cannot. That school buses can park somewhere and we can all access the internet. There isn't a place that a school bus could park, because out here where we live, we don't have neighbors for 10 miles, right? So if a school bus were parked near me, it would have to go through several dirt roads and it wouldn't reach my neighbors, so to speak, right? And then of course that and I will say this from a very personal perspective. My children are picking up a packet of papers to do on Tuesday and turning it in the following Tuesday when I get a new pack of papers. And so, you remember the game, Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? No. My two fifth graders are struggling while my daughter thinks it's fantastic. And she, it's great that she's the teacher in the classroom. My son is taking a test, grading it himself and giving himself hundreds, right? But in the bigger picture, my children are going to have to repeat this grade, right? And I accept that, right? That's a choice that we're making. And my kids will probably be okay graduating a year behind or 2 years behind. But what about our English learners who don't have someone at home because they're essential workers? What about our children in special education? When we're talking about these kids, right, our high risk priority population kids, 8 months of educational loss is the equivalent of 8 years. And a whole bunch of those kids may not recover. And those are real challenges in rural areas that simply are not being discussed, much less addressed.
Right. Yeah. Superintendent Hale, can you speak to that question of some of the things that you experience that maybe wouldn't be true in an urban or suburban context, especially with regards to the pandemic?
Yes, I mean, we just have such a limited staff. So the people to really help with the technology, to keep that up and running, to keep current on everything. We don't have the instructional coaches, the instructional support to really work with the teachers. The best way to do virtual learning. Our Education Service Center out of Amarillo has been doing a great job supporting the rural schools the best that they can, but it's still a lot to overcome this year. These past 8 months, everyone is tired. We're doing the best we can, and the fear of what else may be coming out of this next legislative session with additional requirements or additional mandates that we're already struggling to keep up with.
Right. Um, so it's hard to believe this, but the next legislative session starts in a couple of months. Representative VanDeaver, can you talk about what you anticipate being the primary issues debated in the legislature that will impact rural schools?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the budget is going to be the elephant in the room. We know we are facing a huge deficit. Revenue has decreased, and we know we have a deficit going into session. And so, the budget is going to pretty much take up all the oxygen, I think. My hope is that we will fulfill the promises we made in House Bill 3 to the degree possible. We know that I'm telling my school superintendents, I don't think we'll see the cuts, the $5.4 billion cuts we saw a decade ago. But to think that education is going to come out this session totally unscathed, I think is just unrealistic. There will be some cuts. And so how we do that and do the least damage possible to our school districts and to our students and our teachers, I think that's going to be the priority. And we'll get there. It's not going to be easy. But I know my colleagues that I have visited with are committed to fulfilling the promises made in House Bill 3. So, but no doubt the budget is the big issue.
Right. Superintendent Hale, what, if anything, are you hoping the legislature will do? What are you asking them for this legislative session?
Yes, like Representative VanDeaver said, I realize that there is going to be an issue with the revenue that's available, but just try their very best to sustain the state's portion of House Bill 3. It's very important for the small and rural schools to have that small and mid-sized school adjustment. Our economies of scale are quite different than the urban and rural schools, and we need that additional allotment because it costs more to educate in a smaller classrooms, but we still have the same fixed cost as your urban and rural schools. I would like to see there be a moratorium on the accountability for testing, just because we know that we are behind, and don't put a rating on us for this year. Give us an opportunity to try to make up those gains that we know that we are lacking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Georgina, do you want to add to that? What are you hoping the legislature will do for rural schools in particular?
To have a substantive conversation, right? It's very difficult to fix a problem when you don't even talk about a problem, right? It's very difficult to focus on the types of infrastructure and funding that we need when we rarely, if ever, hear a conversation about that occurring, particularly when we're looking at the shortfalls that our rural schools are facing. Number one, staffing, retention of great teachers. I mean, it's very difficult to get great teachers out in rural areas, and then they can drive 50 miles and make away and make so much more money, right? And then of course the additional salaries that teachers earn when they leave the classroom, right? Because they're moving up into administration, up into leadership. Why in the world are we paying people more to be further away from children, particularly in our rural districts? We need the balancing of wages, of salaries for our teachers to maintain great teachers in the classroom, especially in our rural districts.
We talked a little bit about the accountability ratings and the state standardized test, the STAR, moving forward this upcoming spring. And I know that a lot of superintendents and a lot of teachers and educators generally have been opposed to that, given how different this school year is. You know, we're not actually back to normal. I'm sure you guys would agree with that from what you know from being in schools. What are the chances at this point, and this is for you, Representative VanDeaver, that you know gets pushed off or gets delayed another year? What power and what responsibility does the legislature have to try and make that happen, given what you've heard from educators?
Yeah, I hope that as a legislature, I hope we will do the right thing, which in my opinion is to press pause on accountability. We know that this is unprecedented. You know, there are some that would argue that even without the pandemic, the accountability system is really not fair, and in many cases not fair to rural schools, and doesn't really measure what we intend to measure. And I tend to hold that opinion myself in some areas. But certainly, given the issues we're facing with the pandemic and the challenges we see in our school districts, I just don't see any way we can continue to put a grade on a school district or on a campus, given the challenges they're facing. Now, personally, and this may or may not be popular among the education community. Personally, I do believe we need to go ahead and administer STAR. If you followed my legislation since I've been in the House, I am not a fan of STAR. I will go on record in saying that. I do not believe STAR measures what we intend to measure, and I don't believe it's being used properly. But I do believe we need to have a measurement of where these students are. And personally, I want to see a comparison of the in-person student versus the virtual student or the distant learning student, because my teachers, my school people are telling me that if a student is in class and actually receiving instruction in person from a teacher, they're doing pretty well. But those that are learning virtually are really struggling. And I think we need to measure that. We need to know what that looks like. We need to quantify that so we can address it going forward. So personally, I'm in favor of administering the STAR or some measurement to measure where these students are. But I, with a clear conscience, I can't say we need to continue with the accountability system. At some point, when we get past this pandemic, we're going to have to go back in time and find a benchmark where we can say, this was the last time we really, truly had a measurement, and then take that and move forward from there. We just can't punish school districts for their performance during these very strange times.
Right. How do you feel about that, Superintendent Hale, in terms of moving forward with the STAR but without the accountability?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I think most superintendents, we want accountability. We want a measurement, a benchmark. I don't think there's anyone that would ever disagree with that, honestly. But we don't want the rating associated with it, especially this year. Even though I have few students that are doing remote learning, I have multiple students at any time quarantined because of close contact. And so those students are doing 2 weeks virtual. I have teachers that are quarantined because of close contact. When we don't have broadband internet, the quality of teaching, it's just not the same. Mm-hmm. So I really agree with Representative VanDeaver of going forward with administering the test, but just hold off on that being held to us as being having to meet those standards.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think we just have a few minutes left. I have one, kind of broad question left, but take it where you want to. What is the future of rural schools in Texas?
I personally think I'm a little frightened for it. If we're having to go into use fund balance, as many schools are already having to do, just to keep the doors open, and if we're seeing um, cuts this coming legislative session, that is going to be even harder for schools to maintain that level if we're having to go into fund balance even more. House Bill 3 did a great job of supporting teachers and increasing those teacher salaries, but if we're looking at budget cuts, when the majority of that House Bill 3 money was for teacher salaries, what does that look like in our budget? Nobody wants to go back and take those salary increases back from teachers. I don't know that anybody wants to have that conversation, but I am worried about the future of rural education, just because it is a challenge to find quality teachers. It is a challenge for the internet. It is a challenge for economic development here. So I think I appreciate the Tribune having this panel, and for people to realize the challenges are very real and are different than what urban and large schools face.
Right. Yeah, Georgina, do you wanna answer that?
What I see for, to foreshadow the future, when we're looking at, particularly in rural areas where children can't log on because of the lack of broadband, and parents that grow, or families that grow increasingly frustrated with doing the trying to be, working because they're essential workers out here, and then taking a packet of paper and doing their very best to teach, right, as individuals who are not teachers. That's increasingly frustrating, and it frustrates the children as well. And so when those packets start to disappear, they're not being turned in, that means that's funding that's potentially lost, right? And so not only are we going into the next budget cycle with a deficit, schools are losing children from their enrollment, which also, reduces revenue. So how is the state going to combat that and maintain the promises in House Bill 3 and help rural schools retain quality teachers? These are all serious challenges that, if the state of Texas doesn't make a real investment in public education, our rural schools are going to dramatically struggle to overcome. And I fear, honestly, that many may not, and we're going to start to see a consolidation of our smaller ISDs, which means we have ISDs that are going to consolidate as they are hundreds of miles apart. It's not the way to do things, and it hasn't been for quite some time. And the pandemic really is shining quite a bit of sunlight on where we need to make some serious adjustments.
Right. Yeah, Representative VanDeaver, we'll end with your response to that question.
Okay, yes, and I agree with the comments that have been made. I think I am very concerned about the future of rural education. But I will say this, I believe there is a silver lining to this, because as was mentioned, the pandemic has really placed a light on a lot of the issues that we've been facing in rural Texas for years. And I really believe that those who at one time would say that maybe a teacher is not that important, I don't believe you can say that with a straight face anymore after the pandemic. Those who would say that we can do it much less expensively virtually and get the same results, I believe the pandemic has shown us that that is not the case. So I believe we're getting some great data, and I wish we were not going through it, but I believe we can make lemonade out of these lemons that we've been served, and not take our foot off the gas on rural broadband, on teacher salaries, on teacher recruitment, on teacher prep, those kinds of things. Rural Texas, we have to have our schools. We know that. We know the importance of that. And so it's just important as we go forward that we remember this pandemic and remember the things we've learned from this pandemic, and look for solutions to those issues.
Okay. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to Gary VanDeaver, Gina Pérez, and Donna Hale for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org, and help us keep the conversation going by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.